Hi, I'm Cressel Anderson. This is Makercise. On Facebook, Travis Dial and Chris Utt asked about my table saw sled. I was using it in the Murphy bed video, and I think Travis asked me to describe the slick wooden shuttle or whatever I called it. Travis, this one's for you. And Chris. So this table saw sled has a base, it has a fence in the front and the back, it's got a T-track in the back that has an adjustable end stop. That way you can lock it down and make consistent length cuts. It's also got a quick clamp jig to hold the parts in place, and it's movable so you can unscrew it, and it's got a lot of these T-nuts in the base to allow you to position it wherever you need to. It's also got this plexiglass shield to prevent kickback and a hand barrier here in the back to prevent, to minimize the chances that you're going to get your hand into the table saw.
The first thing I had to do was cut the pieces from the raw materials. I marked the plywood and then I cut it roughly using my circular saw. I cut the pieces to their final dimensions using the table saw. To cut the material for the runners, I selected stock such that the wood grain would be running vertically in the table saw tracks. By sliding the material back and forth in the slots, I could determine where the high spots were on that material and focus on those spots as I scraped or whittled down that material just with a utility knife. The process of refining the width of the runners is something that I ended up scraping several times throughout the process of building the table saw sled.
So I measured the depth of the table saw slots and I set the fence to cut a test strip that I could use to check to make sure the depth was appropriate for the slots before I cut the actual runners. Once I got the first one cut, I had to go back and re-whittle the stock to allow me to cut the second runner. I used some shims to get the runners up enough in the slots so that I could glue them to the base of the sled. I marked the locations of the runners on the sled, and then I drew a line between the marks. That would allow me to position these screws that would attach the runners to the base of the sled. I put down some plastic so that the glue squeeze out didn't get on the table saw.
After that, I marked the locations for the screws that would attach the base to the runners. I used a countersink bit to drill the holes, and then I just used number 6 wood screws, 3/4 of an inch long, to attach the sled base to the runners. And then I trimmed off the excess runners.
So you slide the sled back and forth in the rails. It makes marks on the rails, and then you whittle those high spots down. I used a straight edge to mark the underside of the sled, and that allowed me to use a Forstner bit to make little recesses in the bottom of the sled. I opened it up with a 1/4 inch drill bit, and then I hammered in some T-nuts, and then I countersunk the top side of the sled. The T-nuts should allow me to attach clamps or hold downs or whatever to the top side of the sled. To construct the fences, I ripped approximately 5-inch wide strips of plywood, about 30 inches in length, and I glued them up. I used 3/4 inch plywood for the rear fence, just 2 sheets, that's 1.5 inch total thickness, but I used 3 sheets of 1/2 inch plywood for the front fence. It's just what I had on hand. I glued them up, clamped them up on the edge of the table saw to give it a nice flat reference surface, and then I trimmed off the excess. After I got the fences done, I then applied a bead of glue to the front of the sled, and I clamped on the front fence. Those F-clamps are awesome. They're like sliding seat clamps. I picked that up from watching SV Seeker. If you haven't checked out his channel, you definitely should. Once I had the front fence clamped on, I could start working on the rear fence. I cut a rabbet into the rear fence, and that provides a little bit of relief for sawdust to collect in. Next, I turned my attention to the T-track. The T-track needs a slot cut in the top. I measured the width of the T-track, and then I had to pick the right combination of shims for my dado stack. The dado stack is a set of blades that you can use any combination of to get a particular width. Once I got the dado stack set up, I cut the channel in the top of the rear fence, and it was a pretty good fit for the T-track. Then I needed to cut the T-track to length so it would fit in the rear fence. I decided to do this on the table saw, but I wanted to make a test cut first, just using some scrap aluminum lying around. I took it slow, and it cut the aluminum just fine. So then I scribed a mark into the T-track, set it up on the fence, and I actually used that same test piece as a clamp to help me fixture the T-track into place. As you can see, it made a pretty clean cut. Then I needed to attach the T-track to the fence. After I got the front fence mounted, I had to cut a slot down the base of the sled for my carpenter square to allow me to get the back fence pretty close to perpendicular. I first put a single screw on this side of the sled, and that allowed me to adjust the rear fence so that it was roughly perpendicular to the saw kerf. I then attached the left side of the carriage with a single screw. I trimmed off the excess runners from the rear of the sled. I then used the 5-cut method described by William Ing to adjust my rear fence. You should definitely check out his video if you want to make a super accurate table saw sled. But basically you make 5 cuts, and the error is summed up around those 5 cuts. It gives you the ability to adjust your rear fence so that it's as close to 90 degrees as really you'd probably want for most woodworking projects. Based on the math I did, I ended up using a 20,000 inch shim and moved the left side of the fence forward by 20 thousandths of an inch. I then did another set of 5 cuts to allow me to see on a test piece how close I was to that ideal. Ideally, the top measurement and the bottom measurement would be the same. In my case, they were within 6 thousandths, a pretty good improvement compared to the 50 thousandths that I started out with. I then turned my attention to the adjustable end stop. I marked the height of the piece in the front of the stop, and then I marked the rear piece. And this is really where the hold down clamps shine. After I quickly fabricated the hold down clamp, I was able to use it to secure the small piece from the top of the adjustable end stop. I then used the T-nuts for the T-track and drilled a hole in the little block. I used some plastic again to keep the glue from making that end stop permanent. And then after it was all dry, I just pulled off the plastic. Then I turned my attention to the plexiglass safety guards. Cutting plexiglass is stinky. I had to go outside and get a little bit of fresh air. Whew. It also makes these really crazy looking shavings. I used a hand plane to knock off the crummy edges. To secure the plexiglass fence, I decided I would just make up some little knobs and use the T-track already present on the rear fence. Ended up just using a screw for the front, but this gave me a chance to practice making these little knobs. After I got them cut out on the bandsaw, I marked a bolt to make sure it was the right length for the T-track, filed off the end after I cut it with a hacksaw, and then I pressed it in using a makeshift arbor and my vise. Test fit it on the T-nut, and then I just kind of dressed it up a little bit with a coarse file. After I peeled back the plexiglass protective coating, I installed the makeshift knobs and the T-nuts. Then I used a screw to affix the front. I pulled off the plastic, and I like the way it looks. I figured my existing table saw sled was in for a bit of an upgrade, so I put on the added benefit of the plexiglass safety shield on it as well. Lastly, I wanted to make a handguard for the rear of the new sled, just like I had on my old sled, and it was nice to be able to use the clamps. I used the end stop, And I cut a handful of pieces that are matched lengths, glued them up, I clamped them. It's really nice having a sled so that you can make these repeatable, accurate cuts with small parts on the table saw. After I had it all glued up, I needed to trim away a bit of a relief on the bottom of the guard, raise the blades to the appropriate height based on that mark, and then I secured it. I actually was able to use the T-track on the top of the rear fence to put in my quick clamp. I had to use a few pieces of plywood to block it up since the clamps weren't quite long enough. After the cuts were made, I trimmed off the excess, and I was able to glue the guard onto the rear of the sled. I hope this video inspires you to exercise your inner maker. If you like the video, click the like button. If you have feedback or ideas for future videos, put them in the comments. Check out some of our other videos. We'll see you next time. Another comment related to the Murphy bed video was from Joseph Cummings. I think he was concerned about the stud finder that I was using. I assure you, Joseph, it's calibrated. Slots on the table saw, tracks on the table saw. Table saw.
Your new hashtag should be table saw.
Table saw. Am I saying?